Welcome, FloodGate family. I'm Danny Searing, FloodGate Medical, and we're here with another edition of Improving Live. Today, we're chatting about military to MedTech transition, and I'm have the pleasure of being joined by FloodGate's own Dave O'Hearn. He's a retired Army officer with over 22 years of service. Spent most of his career in the special operations community as a Green Beret. He's led teams at various sizes and levels, amassing more than a dozen trips in support of military operations overseas, numerous Valor Awards, and a Purple Heart recipient. Nowadays, I have the great fortune of working alongside Dave here at FloodGate. He's a talent advisor, one of our top talent advisors, and our Veterans Program Director, where he works very closely with candidates who are looking to transition from the military to MedTech, and also works on the other side with companies that are looking to hire and take advantage of our nation's greatest asset in those military veterans. So we're going to chat about that today, ways to transition, why it's important, why you can do it. So, but before we get into any of that, I'll flip it over to Dave. I gave you a little preamble there, which I'm sure you didn't love, but talk to me about your background, how you got with FloodGate, and what you're doing here today.
Absolutely. So, thanks for having me today. It's absolute pleasure to be here to talk about something I'm very passionate about, which is helping veterans. Being one myself and transitioning out of military service, and they say it's the hardest thing you'll ever do as a military member. You don't believe it until you actually walk through it. And so it's an absolute pleasure to be here to kind of talk about that and how guys can transition with a little bit more ease, hopefully. But then also be able to talk about, why companies should hire veterans and maybe how to overcome some of those obstacles and some of those barriers. With that said, 5 years ago, I retired out of service in 2019. Just like many military service members, when they retire or, transition out of service after fulfilling their commitment, the next step in life is to figure out what it is you want to do for the rest of your life. And the hardest part about that is trying to determine how my military experiences and skills will work and translate and plug into a corporate or a civilian, marketplace, essentially. Myself, when I transitioned out, I just went in, back to the government sector and worked as a contractor for 2 years because it was easy, right? It's the easy button, just doing the same thing that I was doing really in uniform. It's just one day I took the uniform off, the next day I put on a suit and I was back doing the same job, essentially. But really after a couple of years of that, it really started to, I didn't have like that fulfillment that I did before, when I was in uniform, essentially. And, there were some mental health issues and stuff like that, I kind of went through during that period. And so it was a conversation between my wife and I where she's like, hey, you just kind of need to get out 100% completely. And I honestly didn't know what I wanted to do. Fortunately for me, I had a great, connection with Joe McClung, the president of FloodGate Medical. And he asked me, he said, Dave, what do you want to do? What are you passionate about? And we got to unpack some of those things. And really what I was passionate about was really helping people like myself, like veterans, in some capacity or another, whether it was running a nonprofit, or something in that realm that helped veterans either find jobs or transition well, just because of the issues that I kind of dealt with myself. And so Joe kind of gave me a peek behind the curtain at FloodGate, in the medical device industry as a recruiter, and how we could kind of take that passion that I have, and he gave me a platform to really build a program and build something at FloodGate that helps veterans discover or discover careers in kind of that MedTech industry, right? To learn about them and then helping them and coaching them through that transition and helping them find jobs in MedTech. And even if it's not in MedTech, part of it is still helping them transition and helping them land somewhere that fits with their priorities or their passions and whatnot. And so now I've been at FloodGate for going on 2.5 years now. Absolutely love it. It's, people are like, how did you go from being, a steely-eyed killer to now you're, essentially a recruiter, like an HR guy, but for me, my priorities were different. Being gone for so many years, it was about work-life balance, being with my family, watching my kids grow up. And so was really agnostic about kind of my career choice as much as it was most important thing was really about finding the right company and the right culture, that fits my priorities, essentially. So that's kind of how we landed here today, Danny.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that intro. And I mean, I think one of the things I'm sure we'll talk about later is, I mean, how you landed at FloodGate is using your network, right? That you built, even just friends and exploring areas you might have never thought you'd get into, and that's having those conversations a lot of time the best way. So, but first, I want to talk about there's so many, kind of what you alluded to, so many different avenues you could go. It can be overwhelming probably when you're leaving the military and it's like, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, but I don't want to do that. This is, you mentioned the easy button. Why is MedTech, and more specifically MedTech sales, an avenue that could make sense for somebody leaving the military?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of like, why sales? Because I'll tell you what, sales was not something I remotely thought about transitioning out of service. But being where I am today, what I've found with regards to sales, in particular MedTech sales, is that there is actually a lot of overlap with the skills that you have, being in the military, with what you can bring to a sales team. Almost kind of that direct translation, even though it's not like a traditional sales background, there are a lot of soft skills that military veterans bring to the table that make them highly successful on commercial teams, kind of in the MedTech industry. So kind of working at FloodGate and seeing that, I said, wait a minute, this is a great, like, viable career path for military veterans who are coming out of service, because they bring that hard work and discipline, that ethic, right? That you're looking for when it comes to high performers, the loyalty aspect of it. They're going to show up for work every day, and then on the discipline piece, they're going to do the right things every single day, and they're going to bring that consistency that you often see with high performers on sales teams as well. They're great communicators. They can work autonomously, in an ever-changing environment. They're able to adapt, essentially. Military veterans are used to the pressure that's placed upon them to perform, usually in the military, that, oftentimes people, maybe when they're breaking into sales, maybe weren't necessarily prepared for, right? Every bit of activity that you do is measured, right? And there's this pressure to achieve certain outcomes. Military members know what that's like. And so when they come to those teams, I mean, they're already mentally, emotionally prepared, to plug into that team and, pick up an oar and start rowing and be successful, essentially.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, and if I'm somebody, so now I've decided I want to get in. How do I, because as recruiters and companies as they're hiring, when you're looking, especially for a sales role, looking at sales numbers and metrics or relationships, that's easy stuff to kind of measure and see just by looking at somebody's resume or background. But if I'm somebody trying to break in and I don't have that experience, but I have, 2, 5, 10, 20 years of military service, how do I properly market myself and convey all those things that you were just talking about?
Well, I think it starts with having a conversation with people who are already in the industry. All right. So the first step to me, but for any military veteran who's transitioning out of service or considering a career change into MedTech, and particularly into sales, is to find multiple people who are already doing it, right? And have a conversation, because what you're going to learn is you're going to learn a vocabulary. And you're going to learn, and in that vocabulary that you learn, you're going to learn that, hey, wait a minute, I do all of these things. It just looks different on my resume, And so once you're able to kind of learn that vocabulary, then what you can do is you can go back and you can look at your experiences and you tailor your experiences and you center it around what that vocabulary is from that world, essentially. All right. And so those words that you are now communicating and that you're using with hiring managers and whatnot will resonate, essentially. That's really kind of one of the first steps, and then the next, connect with somebody like like me, right? Like a recruiter who can give you those kind of next steps in, what are more likely to make you successful in breaking into the industry, right? It's not just about the resume. It's just not about, curating your LinkedIn profile and all of those things. It's about knowing, hey, what are the right avenues and right paths to go down to where I'm going to achieve like the highest percent of success. Because if you're out there just applying for a sales rep role, you're likely not going to get it, right? Any sales rep role, it's got to be the right roles in the right places with the right companies. And so being able to talk to somebody who understands the market is going to be important as well, because they're going to give you the best advice, in terms of like, hey, here are the viable paths that you're going to find probably the most success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think having those conversations with people that work at the company or that you want to go for, or at in the industry you want to be in, whether it's med device or elsewhere, they'll let you already understand your experience, but it's got to be tailored differently for the role or for the company. And understanding, especially if you could get somebody that has that military background themselves, they could help you. Hey, I know you did this. Here's how you could kind of spin that to make it make sense for this type of role or this type of manager. So I think that's super valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And then some of the other things that will make you successful, if there's a particular company that you're targeting or an industry that you're targeting, doing your homework is super important. Research the company, research the products, understand the market. So when you do have those conversations, what you lack in terms of like traditional experience, you're going to show this, you're going to show the work ethic that you do bring to the table in terms of preparation. Right. Preparation is super important in making an impression on hiring managers. It shows that you're dedicated to the pursuit of the opportunity. And it shows what you're likely going to do if you were to be placed in a particular role with that company, how you approach your work.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I think that's good advice for anybody, whether they're a military veteran or not, but doing that extra research and show, but it definitely for them, that's great. And it'll help you probably figure out too, is this a role or is this the type of thing I want to do? You might do all that research and say, what, I'm learning more and this just isn't the right fit. So that's
absolutely. And on that, the other thing that you've got to do as you transition out of service or looking for that career change, you've got to sit down and really evaluate what are my priorities. Mm-hmm. And list those out. 1, 2, 3. Here are my priorities for that next, next step in my life and my journey and in my career. Whether it's, and there's a litany of them, right? Compensation, geography, work-life balance, culture. There's just so many of them. But you need to narrow it down to really those top 3. Mm-hmm. I think, because that will also help you tailor your search, for the right companies. And when you do have conversations with hiring managers or recruiters, or as you're looking over job descriptions, you can say, well, it's very attractive. It pays a lot of money, but it doesn't fall anywhere within my list of priorities. Probably not the best pursuit, because I'll probably in the long run not be happy. Right. So knowing what those priorities are, especially when you transition out of service, are very, very important. And they should be, they may not be, but for me, they were company agnostic. It didn't matter what industry, it didn't matter what company. It just said, hey, as long as these priorities are met, I'm going to be happy.
Right. Yeah. And it saves you a ton of time too, not pursuing opportunities that just aren't going to be a fit. So that's great. And I will chime in too, over on the right-hand side or below, if you're on mobile, feel free to drop comments. Anybody that's here, questions in the comments, I should say. And we'll be answering those live if any pop up here later. But we've talked about the good. What are some of the challenges, apart from the obvious, or maybe including the obvious, that military veterans will face when trying to transition into MedTech sales?
Yeah, other than a bad market,
yeah.
Things you can't control, essentially. I'd say the number one barrier to veterans getting into at least MedTech specifically are the companies and the hiring managers themselves. Mm-hmm. I would say that companies and hiring managers will say, yeah, I would love to hire a veteran, right? But their traditional models of hiring have been, somebody with, 2 to 3 years of B2B, sales, or maybe they're looking for somebody with light medical already. Those are some things that veterans don't necessarily bring to the table, in terms of experience right away. And so because of that, that can be a barrier to entry into device sales. And what I find oftentimes are hiring managers, they don't want to assume too much risk, when it comes to filling a vacancy within a particular territory, because they say, hey, I need somebody with experience who can come in and start, making an impact right away. And, we've got to maintain our quotas and all of those things. Because I'll be honest, because when you bring in a veteran who's green, right, who's got to learn, the industry, you're going to have to pour a lot more time and energy and effort into that individual to get them to the place that they need to be effective. And so a lot of hiring managers don't either have the time or the resources to do that, depending on the size of the company. And we could talk about that here in a second, like which company should veterans be targeting, if they want to transition in the industry. Depending on the size of the company, they don't necessarily have the time and resources to do that either, right? And so it's a huge risk to hire a veteran, However, but what I've seen is that the hiring managers who do take a risk on hiring, some veterans, where over somebody with a traditional, background that they're looking for in terms of experience, usually in the long run end up better, So it's kind of like, are you looking at the short-term gains or are you looking at the long-term potential? Right. What you'll find with veterans who come into the MedTech industry, their long-term potential with a company is massive. So you may not hit your sales numbers, in that first 6 months of hiring that veteran, but I will tell you, at least within a year or 2 years, you're potentially looking at somebody who's actually moving up to the next level to lead at that point. Right. I see guys who are successful and very quick too. That's another thing veterans bring to the table is they learn very quickly. Like I said, they're adaptable. They can adapt to really any environment that you throw them into, whether it's a surgical environment where they're selling capital or they're selling a commodity or whatever it might be.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned risk. I would argue every hire is a risk, right? And so it's just a harder risk, I think, to measure sometimes in their head. And so I think some of the things you mentioned, and one of the questions I was going to ask is, what, and we've touched on it, but what are those things that I should be looking for because all military veterans aren't created equal, right? So there is somewhere I've got to measure them when they're coming out. What are some things interviewing, or what should I be looking for outside of the tangible, sales experience when I'm vetting out potentially hiring a military veteran as a hiring manager?
Yeah. I think it's important to dive into their military experience because, like you said, not all military veterans are created equal. Just because they're a military veteran doesn't make them awesome. I mean, just like any industry, we've got our high performers, we've got our, mediocre performers. For the most part, I think it's important to dive into their military career and what did they do, right? Because in sales, right, you're selling a solution, right? You're providing a service or a product that solves a problem, and so I think it's important to kind of look back and have them be able to communicate in their military career how they've done these things. Because in the military, depending on what your job is, like every day I was selling a solution to a decision maker, even though it wasn't traditional sales, right? With a potential nebulous outcome too, right? That was very difficult to measure. But I was always selling something and having to present something and communicate something and get a yes, how can we do this? And so it's important for hiring managers to kind of like, okay, so tell me about your experience in the military. How have you done, this, how have you sold, like, tell me about a time you were told no, right? Tell me about a time that, you changed a decision maker's, mind, I guess you could say, right? Or influence change within an organization, right? So those are basic questions that, evaluate somebody's character and their potential versus looking at just sales activity, because in the military too, you're required to show up every day. You're required to perform at a certain level. It's all measured, just like it is in sales. And so I would say looking at the intangibles and those characteristics of people that, indicate what their potential is going to be super important for hiring managers to dig into. They maybe don't know how to do that, right? With a military veteran. And so having a partner is really great. Somebody like FloodGate, who has a veterans program, if you're partnered with us, we can help you kind of bridge that gap too.
Right. Right.
Essentially.
Yeah, well, and I think that goes back earlier to some of it falls on the hiring manager to be able to vet them out properly, but ultimately it's going to fall on the veteran to be able to, even if they're not asked those questions, bring up those examples and understand their value, up front. So, and I was jumping around there just because that popped up, but one of the things I wanted to ask, so and you touched on it earlier, what types of companies should I be going after, or a type of vertical, or even type of position? Walk me through that.
Sure. So this is actually something I've been reflecting on, recently, because there's been a higher demand for veterans. And so I've had a number of these conversations. What I've found are that small companies are not necessarily the companies veterans should be targeting. Because they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to invest into that individual to get them to the level that they need to be from a skill standpoint, right, to be successful. And so if you're a veteran, you're looking to break into medical device, looking at a bigger company that has those resources is important. I think those are where you need to start, essentially. And you see it a lot. Big companies do hire veterans. They have actual veteran recruiters in them. I mean, we could name a few here. Like your Strykers, your Boston Scientifics, your Abbotts. I mean, they have programs for veterans, and they're recruiting for them specifically, but they have the resources, right? So veterans should be looking at those types of companies who have programs already. That's one place to kind of start looking. The other is look at associate roles, right? Don't think that you're going to come out of the military and jump straight into a territory manager or a sales rep role. It's possible for sure, but start focusing your efforts on kind of those associate roles, right? And coming out of service, you may take a step back in compensation for a short period of time, but you have to look at the runway there, and say, oh, look, I might be taking a step back, from a financial perspective initially, but the runway to get where I need to be is certainly there. And this is the pathway to get there, right? So targeting those associate roles are great as well. And there's, you could always take the B2B route. You could always go to a company and get that 2 years, 3 years in B2B, business to business, working for a big company and learning some of those fundamental sales skills, that I think hiring managers are looking for, prospecting, cold calling, presentations, closing deals, contracting, whatever it might be, to kind of supplement all of those things that you bring to the table in terms of soft skills. And so those are kind of really 3 avenues I think to kind of look at initially when you're transitioning out of service. If you don't want to take the B2B route, look at the big companies, focus on associate roles, and then possibly take that business to business sales kind of route.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's great advice. I mean, and I think especially if you're in a time crunch and you need a role quickly, sometimes regardless of where you're at in your career, if you've got experience or not, we've seen it, Dave. I know the job search, whether you're breaking in or looking for a new role in MedTech, can be longer. So understanding that no matter how good you are and how good you interview, sometimes it takes more time, and being patient and doing those right activities consistently, similar to the military, I would presume, is what's ultimately going to get you the best outcome.
Yeah, so, 100%.
Yeah. I know we've got some questions over in the right here, but anything I didn't touch on that you want? I mean, we covered a bunch here from the candidate side. I know we've got at least one question about employers over on the right that we'll touch on, but anything else or words of wisdom that you'd give somebody if they're exiting the military tomorrow, they're looking to head in?
Well, hopefully they're not exiting tomorrow and looking today.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So the one piece of advice is you should be pursuing this and looking at this at least 1 year out from retirement or transition, because it takes time. And we've seen, 2023 was a tough year. Like I said, depends on market conditions, right? It'll take you at least 6 months sometimes to kind of either find the right opportunity and move through the process. At least 6 months, I would say. So you should be looking a year out. Start building that network. Start having those conversations. And then about 6 months out from service is when you really should probably start kind of applying for some jobs, actually going down this path of looking for the right opportunity, if this is the industry that you want to break into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. No, that's a good point. That's you taught me something.
Yeah, like me, I took easy button. I took a job as a contractor, right? But what that also did for me is it gave me time and space, to figure out what I wanted to do.
Right.
But not all of us want to go down that path.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a good point. All right, let's jump into some of these questions. So Sarah asks, in your experience, and we touched on this a little bit, but more directly we can ask it, what are the most in-demand skills and attributes that a MedTech employer is going to be looking for in veteran candidates, and more specifically sales? I mean, what are those top 2 to 3 that you think they're looking for?
I don't know. I'll tell you, the number one thing I hear from hiring managers consistently in every single call is like, I want a hunter. I don't know why I always hear that, and I always have to say, okay, define what you mean by that. But I think what it's going to be, so when I hear hunter, all right, I have to kind of define what that is. To me, that's somebody who's going to show up every single day, and they're going to do those sales activities consistently, and they're going to do them well every single day, regardless of the outcome, right? Because they will find success, eventually, especially if they're doing the right things consistently, and they're persistent, and so they're just going to continue to grind and continue to push until they find that success. And really, that grind and that push is just, like I said, it's doing the same thing every day well. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is probably one of the number one skills that you're going to find, or you're going to find not only from a military veteran, but you're going to find hiring managers want in the right candidates as well.
That grit, that determination, and I mean, who has more than that?
Yeah. Now, there's a lot of other things back there that are going to come with it, right? You know, you got to be able to learn, you got to be able to adapt, you got to be able to communicate. There's all of these things, but I think that's one fundamental thing that is learned through just life experience that young reps don't necessarily have until they get that experience themselves, right? Military veterans have 5, 6, 10, 15, 20 years of that.
Yeah, right.
So it's ingrained.
Yeah, and proven. So that's great. Okay. Next, Karen asks, how should a veteran narrow down their value proposition to sell themselves, and how should they determine the roles that fit best for them? So we talked about that a little bit earlier, but narrowing that down. I mean, if I've done 20 years, how do I thin slice it to here's the things I've done well and how this will translate best?
Yeah, I think it's job dependent, right? You're going to want to tailor your value proposition based on the job that you want. And so really it's about understanding the role and the job that you're going after. And that's where the preparation comes in, and having the conversations with people who are actually doing it kind of come in, because then what that'll allow you to do is to kind of look back in your past and your experience and say, okay, where have I done that? And then finding those very specific examples in your history to bring to the forefront, and that's how you sell yourself to a hiring manager. Say, hey, this is what I understand the job is demanding of me. Here's how I've done that in the past. This is why you should hire me to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, I think, and like you said, tailoring those responses, and a lot of that'll come from that research and having conversations with folks that work there or in the industry to help you out with that. So
what's cool about guys in the military is that, even though you have a specific, military, what they call military occupational specialty, right? Every 2 to 3 years in the military, you're always doing something different, right? There's always a new role. There's always a new position. There's always a new task, so if you've got 10 years of military experience, there's going to be somewhere in that 10 years of military experience that you can likely find, a nugget that's going to be very valuable, and applicable to what it is that you're applying.
Right. And that's not just going to probably, if you're anything like me and have a horrible memory, it's not going to pop up to you during an interview. So it's something that you take the time beforehand. And like you keep mentioning, preparation and understanding how you can best tailor that. So
it should never go into an interview half-cocked.
Winging it. Well, Yeah, and that's actually it's a perfect segue because our next question is from Ashley,
Oh,
and it's how would you recommend that a veteran prepare for an interview specific to med device? It's obviously a different process
yeah,
than
yeah.
military interviews. So sure we could go on and on this one, but any sort of tidbits that you'd say heading in they should be prepared for?
Yeah. So one, we talked about connecting with somebody like myself. There are other organizations out there, like, and I'll promote MedTech Vets on LinkedIn as well. Who focus on this. There are veteran service organizations, nonprofits that help veterans as well as they transition out. Just kind of giving them interview skills and practice and all of those kinds of things. We support an organization, the Honor Foundation, that does this for transitioning, special operations members. So connecting with those organizations is going to be very important to help you prepare for the job search. And then, like you said, Danny, it's about preparation. It's going into every single interview prepared. So it's knowing something about the hiring manager. It's knowing something about the company. It's knowing something about the product. It's knowing something about the market. It's knowing what the job is, where it is, what it demands, right? And then preparing those things that we talked about a little bit ago about, what is valuable to them what do I have that is valuable to them that will help them achieve this, and being able to write those things out before you even have that interview. And then at the end of the day, it's just doing it. Interview after interview after interview. All right. If you land your first interview lands your first job, awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
But the percentages of that happening are like super small, slim. You're probably going to have 10, 15 interviews before you find that right opportunity. And so really it's just about putting yourself out there, getting those interviews and getting that practice in those interviews. And you're probably, you're going to fall flat on your face, you're going to fail. But the great thing about veterans is, I know that they're resilient, and they're going to learn from it, and they're going to grow, and they're going to do better the next time, right? And want that feedback. How can I do this better next time?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it's all tying together, right? All of the preparation, using the skills you've developed, understanding your value, and just going out there and grinding and keeping that head up to ultimately get the goal that you want. So that's awesome. Well, that's what we've got here today. I know we're butting up at the end of time here. So, thank everybody for joining. Thank you, Dave, for this and for your time, but also for all that you do for the veterans. I know it's obviously special to you, but it's it's special to us and special to them. So thank you on behalf of all the veterans for everything that you do. And appreciate your time today. Appreciate everyone joining, and we will see you guys next month on the next edition of Improving Live.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Take care.